The convoy was burning. 14 soldiers pinned behind wreckage, mortars walking closer with every impact, and not a single long-range shooter alive in the unit. Captain Nathan Cole grabbed the nearest soldier by the collar. "Anyone here qualified on a precision rifle? Anyone?" Silence. Smoke. The scream of another mortar dropping 200 meters short. Then a hand went up. Small. Steady. Private Isla Morgan, the logistics clerk. The girl who'd been with the company 4 days and hadn't said 20 words in all of them. She was already moving toward the rifle case. If this kind of story hits different, subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this reaches. The convoy had been moving for 6 hours before the first shell hit. It came without warning, the way the worst things always do. One moment, the lead vehicle was grinding through packed snow and loose gravel on the Karsk Highland Road, headlights cutting pale yellow tunnels through the pre-dawn dark. And the next moment, the world turned white, and the truck lifted completely off its front axle and came down sideways, shedding doors and glass, and one screaming soldier who bounced off the frozen road shoulder and didn't get back up. Private Isla Morgan felt the shockwave through the floor of the fourth vehicle before she heard the explosion. She'd been sitting on a supply crate wedged between 2 stacked ammunition cases, trying to stay warm, not sleeping because sleep in a moving vehicle on mountain roads felt like an invitation. She had a thermos of cold coffee balanced on one knee and a battered paperback she wasn't reading on the other. The blast lifted her half off the crate and slammed her into the ceiling before she knew what was happening. The vehicle skidded hard left. The driver, Corporal Estevez, was already yelling into the radio. Contact left, Bravo lead is down, Bravo lead is..." The second shell hit closer. The transmission exploded into static. Isla hit the deck before anyone told her to. She wasn't sure why. Some instinct that had never quite gone away, even after years of telling herself it was gone. She pressed herself flat against the ridged metal floor, while the vehicle rocked and the air outside turned into a continuous wall of noise. Automatic weapons fire from the ridgeline above, the crack and snap of rounds chewing into rock and steel, men shouting. "Out, out, out!" somebody was screaming. "Get out of the vehicle, move!" She went out the back, rolling clear into the ditch, staying low. The cold hit her like a wall, 15 degrees below freezing and dropping, wind cutting sideways off the high ridge. She pulled her jacket tighter and looked. The lead truck was on its side and burning. The second vehicle had taken something through the engine block and sat dead in the middle of the road, both front tires blown, steam pouring from underneath. Soldiers were scattering, using the trucks for cover, returning fire in short controlled bursts at muzzle flashes on the ridgeline that were 200, maybe 250 meters up. She counted the flashes, 6 positions, maybe 8, spread wide, which meant they'd prepared this. The ambush covered at least 400 meters of road. Someone had done reconnaissance. Someone had sighted these positions deliberately to catch the convoy at the narrowest part of the descent, where the road cut between a sheer rock face on the right and a steep drop on the left. She pressed tighter into the ditch and watched. Captain Nathan Cole materialized out of the smoke to her left, running low, grabbing soldiers by their gear and pointing them toward cover. He was a tall man, lean, with the kind of face that looked permanently like it had just seen something it wasn't going to discuss. 34 years old, 10 years in the service, 3 deployments. She knew that much from his file. She'd processed his supply requisitions twice in the past week. He didn't know her name. On me, he was yelling. "Mathers, get that gun up on the rock. Give me suppression." Sergeant Mathers was down. Isla could see him 30 meters back, sitting against the rear wheel of the fourth vehicle with both hands pressed to his left thigh and his face going the wrong color. Cole grabbed the arm of the nearest soldier. "Quan." "Mathers is hit, sir." "I see that. Get on the gun." "I'm not rated on the M240 cut." "Get on the gun, Corporal." Cole turned and kept moving, grabbing radio handsets, ducking under incoming fire with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this before and hated every second of it. She watched him try 3 different frequencies. Nothing came back. She could tell from the look on his face, a flat, contained expression that she recognized as the military version of panic, that comms were cut. She stayed in the ditch. She was a logistics clerk. She moved supplies. She drafted manifests and tracked inventory and made sure the right ammunition got to the right company before they needed it. She had no business doing anything else. That was the deal she'd made with herself 3 years ago, and she'd kept it. But she kept watching the ridgeline. She couldn't stop. The firing was coordinated. That was the thing. Every time Cole's soldiers looked like they might push toward better cover, one of the ridge positions would open up and pin them down. They were controlling the suppression manually, which meant they had a command position somewhere up there, probably at the center of the line with radio contact to each flank. Standard stuff, honestly. She'd seen the doctrine. She also saw something else. Partway up the right side of the ridge, just below a limestone outcropping that jutted like a broken tooth against the gray sky, there was a position that wasn't firing. It hadn't fired once in the 8 minutes since the ambush opened. It had the best angle on the road, best cover, best sight lines in both directions. It was the sniper position. And the sniper was waiting, not wasting shots on suppression, waiting for someone important to stand up. 2 soldiers broke from cover to drag Mathers toward the rock face. The sniper position flickered. 1 shot. The soldier on Mathers' left arm took it through the shoulder and went down hard, and suddenly nobody was moving anymore, and the mortars started walking back toward the cluster of vehicles. Methodical, patient, 40-meter adjustments. Cole's voice cut across the noise. "Does anyone have eyes on the sniper? Anyone see a position?" Nothing. "Sergeant Durbin." "Durbin's gone, sir." That was Quan behind the machine gun that he definitely didn't know how to operate properly. "Took one in the first 30 seconds. "What about Reyes?" A pause that said everything. Cole stood up slightly, just enough to look at the ridgeline, and immediately a round cracked past him and sparked off the rock 6 inches from his helmet. He dropped. "Son of a—" He pressed his back against the overturned vehicle and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. She could see him counting, trying to think. Then he did the thing she'd been afraid he was going to do. He stood up in the partial shelter of the vehicle's undercarriage, and he shouted, across 40 meters of open ground and incoming fire. "Does anyone have a precision rifle? Any qualified snipers? Anyone?" The ridgeline answered with another burst of automatic fire that sent everyone face down. Isla sat in the ditch. She thought about her paperback. She thought about the cold coffee in the thermos. She thought about the supply depot at Karsk Station and the inventory she was supposed to have finished before this convoy left. And she thought about the manifest for the medical supplies in the 3rd vehicle. And she thought, in the way you think about things when you're trying very hard not to think about something else, about the particular way the sniper position on the ridge hadn't moved since the ambush started. She thought about Sergeant First Class David Okafor, who had been the best shot she'd ever seen and who had taught her everything he knew before. She stopped thinking about that. She looked down at the rifle case she'd been sitting on in the vehicle. It had slid out the back with her when she'd bailed. It was sitting 3 feet away in the ditch, half buried in snow, looking like nothing, looking like just another piece of equipment. She sat with her hand on the latch for probably 10 seconds. Then she picked it up and stood up and walked out of the ditch. "I can." She said it quietly. She wasn't even sure Cole would hear her over the gunfire. But he did, the same way people always seem to hear the thing they weren't expecting, the thing that didn't fit, the thing that cut through noise because it was so wrong it became impossible to ignore. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in 4 days. She was 5'4", brown hair pulled back, a strand of it loose and blowing across her face in the wind. No combat vest. She'd left it in the vehicle because it chafed and logistics clerks didn't need combat vests, did they? A jacket 2 sizes too big. Cold coffee thermos still in her left hand because she'd forgotten she was holding it. "Morgan," he said, like he'd just remembered she existed. "Yes, sir." "Your logistics." "Yes, sir." He looked at the case. "What is that?" "SR-98 chassis with a custom barrel, suppressor, Schmidt, and Bender scope. Mil spec." She paused. "I carry it in my own kit. It's not listed on the manifest." A round cracked off the rock above them and showered them both with pulverized limestone. Neither of them flinched. Cole stared at her. "Can you hit something at 800 meters in this wind?" She glanced at the ridge, calculated automatically without meaning to. Wind speed angle, elevation differential. 712, give or take. Wind's variable, but it's got a pattern, and the sniper position is at about 220 elevation above road level. She paused. "I can hit it." Another mortar. Closer. 50 meters. Somebody screamed. Cole looked at her for exactly 1 more second. Then he said, "Do it." What? She didn't run. Running was wrong. Drew attention. Wasted energy. disrupted her breathing. She moved deliberately, staying low, using the vehicles as cover, picking her route across the road to the rock face on the right side where the angle was better. And there was a natural shelf of stone about 6 feet up she could use as a rest. Quan tracked her from behind the machine gun. "Who the hell is—" "Keep firing," Cole said. "Give her suppression." "Sir, she's a— Keep firing." She reached the rock face and went up the natural shelf in one motion, easy as climbing stairs. Got prone. Unlatched the case. She'd built this rifle herself, piece by piece, over 18 months. The chassis was an MDT ESS. She'd stripped the factory stock and customized the thumb hole, reduced the length of pull a half-inch, added a cheek riser. The barrel was a 26-inch Bartlett, 110 twist, fluted for weight reduction. The suppressor was an OSS Helix, which was bulky but cut the sound signature to something approaching manageable. The scope was a Schmidt & Bender PMII 525X with a tremor reticle, and she knew every click of its elevation turret the way musicians know the frets of a guitar. She'd kept all of it because she hadn't been able to make herself get rid of it. She told herself it was sentimental. She told herself a lot of things. She pressed her cheek to the stock. The fit was perfect. It always was. Whatever else had fallen apart, the rifle fit. She looked through the scope. The ridgeline snapped into sharp definition. She swept left to right, saw the enemy positions, counted them, confirmed what she'd calculated from the ditch. 6 definite firing positions, 2 probable. And there, at the base of the limestone outcropping, the sniper had moved. She didn't react. You don't react? You breathe, and you adjust, and you look. He'd shifted maybe 15 meters right, setting up on a new angle. Smarter position than the first one, actually. Better rock cover, but it forced him onto a slope which was going to affect his stability. He was going prone now, settling his rifle, which meant he had a target selected. She swept back to the road. Cole was moving again, exposing himself to coordinate his soldiers, and she understood immediately. The enemy sniper had been patient, and now he'd found his shot. She came back to the position. The sniper was prone, partially obscured by rock. She could see maybe 40% of his body, left shoulder, part of his helmet, the rifle barrel extending past the rock edge. The wind came in a gust and then a lull, and she felt the lull in her face and her hands simultaneously. She didn't think. Thinking was wrong at this distance. Thinking introduced variables. She pressed the trigger to the rear with steady, even pressure, and at some point during that pressure the rifle fired. She was never entirely sure exactly when, because that was how it was supposed to work, the shot surprising even the shooter to eliminate anticipation. And the suppressor ate most of the muzzle blast, and the enemy sniper's rifle barrel dropped forward, and his helmet hit the rock, and he didn't move again. 706 meters. The wind had shifted slightly left in the last half second, and she'd compensated without consciously deciding to. She was already moving to the next target before anyone on her side had registered the shot. The machine gun nest was the priority. It was positioned on a natural terrace about halfway up the ridge. Perfect elevation, good sight lines, and it was chewing through her side's ability to move. The gunner had a rhythm, 3-second bursts, reload, 3-second bursts, predictable. That was the problem with comfort. It made you predictable. She waited through one burst, then the reload. The shot took the gunner at the base of the throat. Clean, immediate. His assistant tried to pick up the gun, and she put her second round through the receiver housing, and the gun went silent. On the road below, something changed. She could feel it, the shift in volume and frequency as the suppressing fire from above decreased and the soldiers below started moving again, pushing for better cover, dragging casualties. Cole was pointing, directing, and she tracked along the ridge to protect the movement. Third shot. The enemy radio operator she'd identified from the communications antenna above his position. Without the radio, the ridge positions couldn't coordinate. Without coordination, the ambush became a collection of individual firefights instead of a unified assault. Fourth shot. The spotter for the mortar team, 200 meters back from the ridge proper, nearly invisible behind a pile of loose stone. She'd seen his head appear twice, just briefly, just enough to glass the road and call adjustments to the mortar crew. She waited. When he appeared the third time, she was already in her natural respiratory pause, and she took him mid-breath, and the mortar fire stopped 6 seconds later when the crew realized they'd lost their eyes. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be. The cold was doing it, constricting everything, making the muscles in her hands work harder. She flexed her fingers on the forend, forced herself to breathe slowly, checked her position, and kept looking. Below on the road, Corporal Kwan had gotten the M240 working properly, or something close to it, and was raking the ridge from left to right, creating enough noise and confusion that 3 soldiers were now up and moving, pulling casualties behind the rock face, doing the work they'd been unable to do for the past 20 minutes. Cole appeared at the base of her position, looking up. He had blood on his left hand, not his own, she thought, because he was moving fine. 3 positions still active on the left flank, she called down, keeping her voice even. Can you reach them? Yes. Then reach them. She was already back in the scope. Bob. The thing about sustained precision fire that nobody talked about was the weight of it. Not the physical weight. The rifle was 8.5 pounds and she was used to it. The other kind. The accumulated weight of each individual decision that had to be made in a fraction of a second and couldn't be undone. Isla had learned to work in a specific headspace, narrow, focused, almost mechanical. You didn't engage your whole mind. You gave the task the part of your mind that measured and calculated and tracked wind and elevation and moving targets, and you kept the other part, the part that noticed things like faces and what they meant, somewhere quiet and out of the way. She was managing it. She was managing it fine. Then the lead vehicle rolled into the valley mouth below. It was big. Not a main battle tank, something lighter, a wheeled armored vehicle she identified as a modified BTR variant. Behind it, 2 more. They moved slowly, deliberately, headlights cutting through the settling smoke, and something about the way they moved, the spacing, the formation, wasn't purely tactical. It was theatrical. Somebody behind those headlights was making a statement. She tracked to the lead vehicle. Through the scope, she could see the command hatch was open, which was stupid, which meant whoever was in it was either very confident or wanted to be seen. She saw a figure standing in the hatch, field glasses raised. Even at this distance, even with the scope and the smoke between them, something hit her like cold water. The posture, the way he held his shoulders, the specific tilt of his head when he raised the field glasses. She knew that posture. She'd studied it in briefing photographs for 3 months before a mission that had gone wrong in every direction and cost the best man she'd ever known his life. She couldn't see his face. She didn't need to. Her hands began to shake. Not the micro tremor of cold muscles that she could manage. Not the fine vibration of exertion. She'd been trained past that. This was something deeper. Something in her chest that had been locked in a box for 3 years and was now pressing up against the lid with everything it had. She pulled back from the scope. Breathed. Below her, Cole had seen the vehicles too. She could hear him on a radio that was partially working now. One of the soldiers had jury-rigged an antenna extension from salvaged equipment, trying to reach anyone outside the valley. Any station? Any station? This is Bravo 6. We are in contact at grid. She pressed her eye back to the scope and forced herself to look at the man in the hatch. Darius Voss. She hadn't spoken the name out loud in 3 years. Hadn't written it. Had trained herself not to think it. But here it was, surfacing the way things surfaced when you thought you'd buried them deep enough. Sudden, complete, and absolutely indifferent to your preparations. Voss. The man connected to the mission that had killed David Okafor. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed her left fist harder against the forend, trying to stabilize through strength, which was wrong. She knew it was wrong. You couldn't force precision, and she knew that. But she couldn't get the trembling to stop. Below her, Cole's jury-rigged radio crackled. She heard a voice respond, distant and broken with static, and Cole made a sharp sound of relief. Then the static resolved into something coherent, and the voice said, Bravo 6, be advised. Enemy units have issued a specific request for designation. They are not targeting your unit. Repeat, enemy units are not targeting your convoy. Cole said, then what are they targeting? The voice said, they're asking for a shooter, by name. They're asking for... Static. Cole looked up at her. She was already looking back at him, and she already knew what name had come through the static before it cut out, because there was only one name it could have been. The static held for 4 seconds. Then it broke apart completely, and the radio went dead again. And Nathan Cole was left standing at the base of the rock shelf with his hand pressed to the earpiece and the silence of a cut transmission filling the space where words should have been. He looked up at her. She was already climbing down from the shelf, moving carefully, the rifle slung across her back. Her face was the same face it had been for the 4 days he'd known her, or not known her, because that was more accurate. The face he'd walked past a dozen times in the supply tent and never registered as anything other than background. Logistics, inventory, not his problem. He was revising that assessment in real time. Morgan. He caught her arm when she reached the ground. What did they say before the static? You heard it? She looked at the hand on her arm, then at his face. Not hostile, just measuring. They said a name, she said. Whose name? She didn't answer that. She pulled her arm free, not roughly, and turned toward the road where the 3 armored vehicles had stopped at the valley mouth, engines idling, headlights burning through the smoke. The man in the command hatch had lowered his field glasses. Even at this distance, she could see he wasn't looking at the convoy anymore. I was looking at the ridgeline, at the shelf where she'd been lying. We need to get everyone consolidated, she said. The 3 positions on the left flank. I can take them from that outcropping above the second vehicle. Better angle. But I need someone to move with me. Carry extra magazines. I'm down to 9 rounds. Cole stared at her. You have 9 rounds left. I started with 22. I used 13. You... He stopped, looked at the ridge, counted the positions that were no longer firing, looked back at her. Who are you? She met his eyes for a moment. I'm the person who can get you out of this valley, she said. If we stop talking and start moving. He let it go. A man in Cole's position, 14 soldiers, 3 vehicles down, no air support, comms that were 40% functional at best, and armored vehicles now blocking the exit, didn't have the luxury of needing a full biography before accepting help. He'd learned that on his second deployment. Probably his first, honestly, but it took 2 to make it stick. Quan. He turned to the corporal, who had moved from behind the M240 and was now crouched against the rock face, watching the armored vehicles with an expression that mixed relief and new fear in approximately equal proportion. You're on the gun until Mathers can stand. Don't spray. Controlled bursts. Watch your barrel heat. Yes, sir. Sir, those vehicles, I see them. They're not advancing. No, Cole said. They're not. He said it the way you say something when you've noticed a thing and haven't figured out what it means yet and don't want to admit either. He turned back to Isla. Show me the outcropping. She moved and he followed, staying low, cutting across the road in the gap between 2 suppressed burst cycles. 2 other soldiers peeled off and came with them, Privates Hartman and Ruiz, both of them young, both of them running on adrenaline and showing it in the way they moved. Too fast, too jerky. She noted it and said nothing. The outcropping was a natural ledge about 30 meters up the rock face, accessible via a fault line that cut diagonally through the cliff. It was a harder climb than the shelf she'd used before, hands and feet both, exposed for maybe 12 feet in the middle section. She went up first, pulling herself through the exposed section without stopping, because stopping in an exposed section was worse than moving through it. The rifle banged against her back twice and she ignored it. When she reached the ledge, she pressed flat and looked. Better angle, as she'd calculated. The 3 remaining positions on the left flank were visible from here in a way they hadn't been from below. She could see behind the rocks they were using for cover, see the bodies behind the guns instead of just the gun muzzles and muzzle flash. She could also see, from this new elevation, something she hadn't been able to see from the road. There were more of them. Not on the ridge, behind it. On the reverse slope, maybe 200 meters back from the crest, partially screened by dead ground, she could see vehicle signatures and the distinct thermal signature of men moving in formation. A staging area. Which meant the 3 positions on the left flank weren't the tail end of this ambush. They were the tail end of the first wave. Cole pulled himself onto the ledge beside her, breathing harder than she was. I was tall, and the climb had been awkward for him, and his left knee was going to feel that later, she thought. Hartman and Ruiz came up behind him and immediately started scanning with their rifles, which was correct instinct even if their technique needed work. What do you see? Cole asked. Staging area on the reverse slope. 2 vehicles, minimum 8 personnel. They're waiting. Waiting for what? She thought about the armored vehicles at the valley mouth, about the man in the command hatch, and the specific way he'd stopped looking at the convoy and started looking at the ridgeline. For confirmation, she said. Of what? She didn't answer that either. Cole looked at the side of her face. She could feel him doing it. He had the quality, unusual in people his rank, of knowing when to push and when to wait. And he was waiting now, but barely. She could feel the questions backing up behind his patience like water behind a dam. She got into position, settled the rifle, and started working. The first of the 3 remaining positions went quiet at a range of 430 meters. The second at 390. Clean shots, both of them. She was at the near edge of her optimal range now, and the suppressor was doing its job, converting the signature to something that sounded like a distant hand clap rather than a rifle report. The remaining enemy fighters on the ridge didn't immediately locate her. The third position was the problem. The gunner had moved. She swept back to where he'd been and found empty rock. Swept left, right, nothing. He was either prone behind cover she couldn't penetrate with optics alone, or he'd identified her general position and gone to ground. Lost the third shooter, she said. Where? That's what lost means. Ruiz made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Cole gave him a look that ended it. Can you flush him? Not without exposing myself on this ledge. She kept scanning. Give me 40 seconds. She used 30. The gunner had gone behind a rock formation that looked solid from below, but from this elevated angle had a 2-foot gap at the top, not enough to shoot through, but enough to see the color of his jacket sleeve when he shifted his weight. She tracked the gap, waited, and when the sleeve appeared a second time, she put the shot through the gap, and the sleeve disappeared and nothing moved after that. She exhaled. 3, she said. Below on the road, she could hear the change, the volume dropping, the rhythm of fire from above collapsing. Cole's soldiers started moving again, consolidating behind the rock face, pulling casualties, redistributing ammunition. She could hear Quan calling out positions and someone answering, and the particular sound of military organization reasserting itself after chaos, which was a sound she recognized from another life. Morgan. Cole was beside her, his voice lower now. The immediate crisis was not over, but the first acute phase of it was, and that meant he had enough mental space back to start asking the questions he'd been banking. She'd known it was coming. Talk to me. The reverse slope staging area is going to move in the next 20 minutes, she said. They'll either commit to a ground assault or pull back. If the armored vehicles at the valley mouth advance at the same time, I know the tactical situation. That's not what I'm asking. She kept looking through the scope. The man in the command hatch still hadn't moved. He had lowered his field glasses and was standing with his hands on the hatch rim, head slightly tilted. And even at this distance, there was something in the posture that she could only describe as patient. The way a person who has decided something is patient. Not waiting to see what happens. Waiting for what they've already set in motion. You have 13 confirmed kills on that ridgeline, Cole said. In under 40 minutes. A logistics clerk. Supply specialist. Right. He paused. And before that? Before what, sir? Before logistics. She let about 5 seconds pass. Through the scope, she watched Voss in his command hatch, watched him reach up and adjust something on his radio, watched him speak to someone she couldn't see inside the vehicle. I was in a different program, she said. I'm not in it anymore. What program? A classified one, which means I'm not going to tell you what it was called or what it did. I was quiet for a moment. Are you still active? No? But you kept the rifle. Yes? Why? She pulled back from the scope, looked at him directly. He had the flat brown eyes of someone who'd learned to process bad news without showing it, and they were doing that now, taking in what he was seeing and revising his understanding and keeping his face neutral while he did it. Because I couldn't decide if I'd ever need it again, she said. And apparently I was right to keep it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. A small, practical nod. The kind that says we'll deal with the rest of this later without actually saying it, and turned back to the road. Tell me about the staging area. She talked and he listened, which in her experience was not a universal quality in officers, but was apparently one of his. She laid out what she'd seen on the reverse slope, vehicle count, personnel estimate, the likely approach routes given the terrain, the timing window she thought they had. He asked 2 questions during the whole explanation. Neither of them was stupid. She noted that. Below, his soldiers had gotten Mathers and the other wounded into a consolidated position behind the overturned lead vehicle, which provided the best ballistic cover available on the road. Someone had found a medical kit and was working on Mathers' leg with more determination than technique, but Mathers was conscious and talking, which were both good signs. Ruiz had climbed back down and was helping redistribute ammunition. Hartman had stayed on the ledge, watching the road with wide eyes, trying to look useful. Cole pulled out a map, actual paper, laminated, the good kind that didn't disintegrate in the wet, and spread it on the rock face of the ledge. If they push from the reverse slope down through here, his finger traced the most likely approach corridor, our only options are back up the road, which is where the armored vehicles are, or into the ravine on the left side. The ravine runs parallel to the road for about 800 meters, she said. Then it narrows. Bad terrain for a firefight. But they might not follow into it if they've got vehicles. Might not. She studied the map. The contour lines showed what she'd estimated from observation. The ravine dropped sharply within the first 300 meters, which would make it difficult to flank, but also difficult to exit. If we go into the ravine, we need a rally point, something defensible. There, Cole's finger landed on the map. Old observation tower, Karsk 7, built before the ceasefire, should be partially intact. She looked at where his finger was, looked at the terrain, did the math. That's 4 kilometers through the ravine. Yes. With wounded. Yes. He folded the map. Which is why I'd rather not go that route. Which is why I'd like to know if there's another option I'm not seeing. The radio crackled. Quan's voice came through. Sir, the armored vehicles are moving. Cole grabbed the handset. Which direction? Toward us, sir. All 3. Slow. Cole looked at Isla. She looked back. Okay, he said. Tell me about the man in the command vehicle. The question landed differently than she expected. Not an accusation. He didn't have enough information to frame it as that. But he'd noticed something, the way he'd noticed her, in the particular way of people who paid attention even when they didn't have a reason to yet. What makes you think I know anything about him? She said. Because you pulled back from the scope, and you haven't looked at him again, and before that you looked at him like you recognized him. Cole's voice was even. And because the radio transmission said they were hunting a specific person by name, and the only person on this ridgeline who's done anything that would merit hunting by name is you. He paused. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with. Hartman was listening. She could tell from the slight change in the angle of his shoulders, the way people's bodies change when they stop pretending not to listen. She looked at Cole. Can we have 5 minutes without an audience? Cole glanced at Hartman. Go check on Mathers. Hartman went. She waited until his boots had scraped off the ledge and the sounds of his descent had faded. Then she looked at the armored vehicles, which were moving at maybe 10 kilometers per hour, deliberate, unhurried. His name is Darius Voss, she said. He's the operational commander for whatever element is running this ambush. He's been on intelligence watch list for 3 years because of operations in the northern provinces, civilian targets, deliberate. He's not regular military, he's contract, which means he has very specific objectives and very specific clients, and he doesn't generally appear in the field himself unless the objective is something he considers important enough to supervise personally. Cole was quiet. 3 years ago, she said, I was part of a team running a reconnaissance mission in a different theater. Long-range insertion, 2 weeks in the field, specific surveillance objectives. Voss was the target. We were supposed to document, not engage, build the intelligence case. She stopped, looked at the vehicles. Voss had a second element we didn't know about. They found our hide. We had to move fast, and when we moved fast, we made mistakes, and one of those mistakes cost my spotter his life. She kept her voice flat. She'd gotten very good at keeping her voice flat about this. I made a decision in the field that day that I've spent 3 years deciding was the wrong one, and then I transferred to logistics and I tried to make the rifle not exist. Cole said nothing for a long moment. What was the decision? He said finally. I chose to move instead of staying and taking the shot. I thought I could get us both out. I was wrong. She paused. If I'd taken the shot, Voss would be dead and my spotter would be alive. Or maybe Voss's second element would have responded, and we'd both be dead. I've run both versions in my head approximately 10,000 times and I still don't know. And now he's here. Now he's here. Cole looked at the vehicles. He came personally because of you. I think he came because of the convoy. We're carrying medical supplies to forward positions that would extend field operations by 4 to 6 weeks. Cutting that supply line has value. But, she stopped. But the radio transmission. If he specifically identified me and issued a personal request, then either his intelligence is very good and he knew I was with this convoy, or he identified me from the ridge work and now he's altered his objective. Either way. Either way, yes. Cole pressed his lips together, looked at the map, looked at her. Is there anyone who'd want you dead badly enough to put an operation together? I don't know. I've been moving supplies for 3 years. I'm not exactly a priority target. She hesitated. But if Voss holds me personally responsible for something that happened after that mission, consequences he faced, assets he lost, then maybe. Okay. Cole straightened. Here's what I know. I have 12 soldiers still able to fight, 2 who need medical attention within the next 2 hours or we start losing them, no air support, and 3 armored vehicles coming down a mountain road at us. He looked at her. I also have a sniper who I apparently know nothing about, and the enemy commander appears to want that sniper specifically, which is either a vulnerability or an advantage depending on how we play it. She looked at him. You're thinking about using me as bait, she said. I'm thinking about options, he said. Tell me why that one's bad. It's not necessarily bad, it's just complicated. How? She looked at the lead armored vehicle, at the command hatch, at the man standing in it. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped sometime in the last 20 minutes. She wasn't sure exactly when, which maybe meant it had stopped gradually, without her noticing. The way some things resolved themselves while you were paying attention to other things. Because if Voss is here in person and he's positioned himself in the command vehicle, instead of running the operation from the rear, he's either arrogant or he has specific leverage, she said. And arrogant people make mistakes, but people with leverage use it. She paused. If he has something to use against me, a person, information, something, he'll use it at the moment when I'm most exposed. And that's exactly when he'd want me exposed, taking a shot from a fixed position. So he wants to draw you out. Possibly. And if he does, what does he have? She was quiet for 3 seconds. I don't know, she said, but I'd like to find out before I put my eye back in that scope. The radio crackled again. Quan. Sir, the lead vehicle's stopped. There's someone getting out, on foot. They've got a person with them. Looks like static. Then Quan's voice again, flatter this time, stripped of anything except the words. Sir, it's a civilian. They've got a civilian. They're walking her toward us. Cole grabbed the handset. Can you ID the civilian? A pause. Female. Young. Maybe 20. She's in a field medical vest. She's got Red Cross markings. Isla was already back in the scope. The scene assembled itself in the magnified circle of her optic. 2 armed figures emerging from the lead vehicle, and between them a young woman in a medical vest, hands zip-tied in front of her, moving in the stumbling walk of someone who'd been in a confined space too long. The medical vest had the distinctive Red Cross of humanitarian support personnel. The convoy they were escorting hadn't just been carrying ammunition resupply. It had been carrying a medical team to a forward aid station. 3 personnel. She'd processed the manifest herself. She knew exactly how many people were in that manifest. She swept back to the command hatch. Voss was still there, still patient, and now he was looking directly at the ledge where she was lying. He couldn't see her. The distance was too great and she was prone behind rock cover, but he was looking at the exact position because he'd calculated where she'd be. Elevation, angle, sight lines, and he'd put the shot together in his head the way she would have, and now he was waiting to see if she'd confirm it by doing something, like reacting to the hostage. She pulled back from the scope. Her jaw was tight. He's not hunting me, she said. He's hunting my trigger. Cole was listening. He wants me to take a shot from a fixed position while I'm emotional, exposed, compromised, reacting instead of thinking. She kept her voice level with some effort. He did something like this before, in the northern provinces. He used a civilian vehicle as a screen and kept a reaction force in dead ground and waited for the shooter to commit. And 2 of our people died walking into it. Cole looked at her. Were you there? No, I read the after-action report. She paused. David, my spotter, wrote it 12 days before he died. The silence on the ledge was very complete for a moment. Below, she could hear the soldiers on the road and the distant idling of the armored vehicles and the wind off the ridge, which had dropped slightly, maybe 5 knots, which would make the long shots easier. She noticed herself noticing that. Noticed herself automatically cataloging environmental factors. She wasn't sure if that was training reasserting itself or if it was something simpler, the part of her that had never fully stepped back from this, no matter how many logistics manifests she'd filed. If I don't respond to the hostage, he may harm her to force a reaction, she said. If I do respond, I'm walking into his trap. Is there a third option? She thought about it. The way she used to think about field problems, breaking them down, looking at the variables that could be controlled and the variables that couldn't, finding the angle that wasn't obvious because it wasn't what the situation invited you to see. The hostage is his leverage. If I can remove the hostage from his control without committing to a fixed shooting position, he loses the tool. She looked at the terrain, the road, the distance between the armored vehicles and the rock face where the survivors were consolidated. But I'd need to be moving when I do it, mobile, which means less stability, longer time of flight accepted, greater error margin. What's your hit probability on a moving shot in these conditions? She thought about David, about the long conversations they'd had in hides and observation posts about exactly this kind of calculation. He'd always said she was better at math than she was at feelings, which had been both a compliment and a diagnosis. Not good enough, she said honestly. Not from this distance, not at the armed escorts without risking the hostage. So we need to get closer. One of us does. Cole looked at her. She looked back. Then below them, clearly audible even at this elevation, one of the armed escorts shouted something toward the rock face, where Cole's soldiers were sheltering. The words were in a language she didn't speak, but a voice came through after them in flat, accented English. The voice was Voss's. Even amplified through a loudspeaker on the vehicle, it was recognizable. She'd heard recordings of it in mission briefings years ago, a voice that was carefully modulated, never raised, designed to convey that raising it was unnecessary because the outcome was already decided. We have one of your medical personnel. She is unharmed. We are prepared to exchange her for the shooter who has been operating on the ridgeline. You have 10 minutes to decide. After 10 minutes, we will drive back up this road, and you will not see her again. The transmission cut. 10 minutes. Cole looked at Isla. She was already running the calculations. The third option wasn't elegant. It wasn't what she'd have designed if she'd had a week and a planning room and good intelligence. It was what you got when you had 9 rounds, a compromised position, an enemy commander who knew her tendencies, and 10 minutes. But there was something Voss didn't know. Something none of them knew. Not Cole, not Quan, not the soldiers on the road, not the men on the reverse slope waiting for their signal. She'd made a decision 3 years ago that she'd spent 3 years calling the wrong one. She'd chosen survival over the shot. She'd moved instead of staying. She'd let Voss walk away because she'd calculated that moving was the right answer, and then watched everything fall apart anyway. She was done letting that decision define the next one. 9 rounds, she said quietly. It wasn't directed at Cole. It was directed at the air, at the calculation, at herself. Then she looked at him. I need you to do something for me. What? When this starts, don't try to stop it. Whatever it looks like, don't stop it. Cole held her gaze. His expression said he didn't entirely like what he was hearing, but his voice said, okay. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out 3 additional rounds she'd been carrying as a personal reserve. Rounds she'd loaded herself, back when she'd kept the rifle because she couldn't decide if she'd need it. Brought the total to 12 rounds, 3 armored vehicles, 2 armed escorts with a hostage, unknown number of personnel in the staging area on the reverse slope. Voss in a command hatch, patient as stone, waiting to see what she'd do. She started moving toward the edge of the ledge. Morgan. Cole's voice stopped her. She looked back. He was watching her with something in his face she couldn't quite name. Not concern exactly, not admiration, something more complicated. I don't know what happened to your spotter, he said, but whatever decision you made that day, you're here. He'd probably want you to use that. She looked at him for a long moment. You didn't know him, she said. No. But you're right, she said. He would. She went over the edge. The descent took 90 seconds. She didn't rush it. Rushing on the fault line would mean a twisted ankle or a dropped rifle or both, and she couldn't afford either. But she moved with the specific economy of someone who'd done this kind of thing before and still remembered how. Hands on rock, weight transferred, feet finding edges by feel more than sight. The wind had dropped another 2 knots. She noted it automatically. When she hit the road, she went immediately to Cole's consolidated position behind the overturned lead vehicle and crouched beside Quan, who looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the shelf, like he was trying to reconcile two different people occupying the same body. "How many rounds do you have for the M240? She asked. "Maybe 250 on the belt. I've got another box, but it's in the—" "Get it." He went. She looked at the road. The two armed escorts had stopped maybe 60 meters from the vehicle barricade, the hostage between them. The young woman in the medical vest was standing with her hands in front of her and her chin up, which Isla noted, not crumpling, trying to hold herself together. Good. That mattered. The lead armored vehicle sat 100 meters behind the escorts, engine running, Voss still in the hatch. She looked at the terrain between here and there. The road was exposed, obviously. Open ground, no cover. But to the left of the road there was a shallow drainage ditch that ran parallel to the barricade for maybe 40 meters before curving out toward the open valley. During winter, the ditch would fill with runoff, but the freeze had locked it solid, which meant the bottom was hard ground rather than mud. Low cover. Maybe 18 inches of depression below road level, not enough to stand in, enough to crawl in. Ruiz had come back up the ridge during her conversation with Cole. He was crouched 4 feet away, watching the escorts. "Ruiz," she said. "Yeah. You're going to make noise in approximately 8 minutes, a lot of it, muzzle flashes, if you can manage it, coming from the far side of the second vehicle. You want their attention on that side of the road." He looked at her. "And where will you be?" She looked at the drainage ditch. "Oh," he said. Then, "That's a long crawl." "Yes." "What do I do if—" "Don't let them advance. Whatever happens, keep them looking right." She paused. "And keep Quan off the machine gun until I'm out of the lane." Ruiz nodded. I was maybe 22 years old and he was scared and doing his best not to show it, and those two facts together made her feel something she didn't entirely want to feel right now, so she set it aside. Cole came back down from the ledge. He looked at the ditch, looked at her. He'd been up there long enough to have watched her plan assemble itself, and from the expression on his face he'd understood most of it. "You're going in the ditch," he said. "Yes." "To do what?" "Remove the hostage from his equation." "And then?" "Then I'll have a better angle on the vehicle." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him calculating the risks, the alternatives, the fact that he had 9 minutes left and no better option on the table. "What do you need from me?" "For your people to stay in position and not do anything that looks like a response to his ultimatum until I say so." "And how will I know when you say so?" "You'll hear it." He looked at her steadily. "Morgan, if this goes wrong—" "It might," she said. "That's not a reason not to try." He closed his mouth, nodded once. She went to the ditch. The crawl took longer than she wanted. 40 meters of frozen ground on her elbows and knees, rifle cradled in the crooks of her arms to keep the scope out of the dirt, moving in the stop-start rhythm of a person who is counting seconds in their head and matching movement to the ambient noise level. Every gust of wind gave her a few seconds of cover. Every lull stopped her flat. Her elbows were bleeding before she hit the halfway point. The frozen ground was ice over gravel, and the gravel was not interested in being kind about it. She noted the pain and filed it and kept moving. The ditch curved at the 40-meter mark, and she was now off the road's axis, angled slightly toward the open ground where the escorts were standing. She could hear them now, muffled voices, the particular restless sound of armed men who are waiting and bored in that specific dangerous way of bored armed men. One of them said something and the other one laughed, short and humorless. She got to one knee. The lip of the ditch gave her cover up to her chin. She looked over it. 32 meters. The escorts were in three-quarter profile to her, facing the barricade, attention forward. The hostage was between them, slightly ahead, being held by the upper arm by the escort on the right. She could see the young woman's face now, pale, jaw set, eyes fixed on the barricade with the determined expression of someone who had decided that looking at the barricade was better than thinking about what was behind her. 32 meters was too close for the precision rifle. At this range, the weapon was massively overpowered, and the trajectory was flat enough that any miscalculation in angle would carry through the target and potentially into the hostage. She needed to be farther left. She needed to change the angle. She kept going. 10 more meters, moving slower now, more careful. the voices above the ditch closer, and the margin for noise shrinking with every foot. She moved in the lulls. Wind gust, 3 feet, lull, stop. Wind gust, 2 feet, lull, stop. At the 50-meter mark, she risked another look. Better angle. The escorts were now at more of a side profile, the hostage slightly further from the left escort, who was the closer of the two to her position. She ran the geometry. If she took the right escort first, the one with the grip on the hostage's arm, there was maybe a half-second window before the left escort reacted. In that half-second, the hostage would be free of the grip and either going to ground or standing confused, and the left escort would be bringing his weapon up, and she'd need to be already moving to the second shot. The geometry worked, barely. The margin for error was narrow enough that she felt it in her chest, that specific constriction that wasn't fear exactly, but was the physical fact of knowing that the distance between acceptable outcome and catastrophe was measured in fractions of a second, and the steadiness of her own hands. Her hands were steady. She checked them, actually looked at them. Steady. She got prone on the ditch lip, got the rifle up, pressed her cheek to the stock. The right escort filled the scope. Body armor. She could see the plate carrier, which meant she needed either a high chest shot above the plate or she shifted. The gap at his collar, where the armor didn't meet the helmet. Acceptable. It was a smaller target, but she was at 50 meters, and at 50 meters she could thread around through a 2-inch gap without losing sleep over it. She used to, anyway. She found her respiratory pause. 8 minutes had passed. She needed Ruiz to start making noise. As if he'd been watching her through the scope somehow, which he hadn't. She knew the timing was coincidence and professionalism, which were sometimes indistinguishable. The far side of the second vehicle erupted in muzzle flash and controlled rifle fire. Not aimed at anything real. Aimed at the air, the ridgeline, creating pattern and noise, and most importantly redirecting every set of eyes and ears toward the right side of the road. Both escorts turned. She fired. The right escort dropped before the sound of the shot had time to travel. The left escort started turning back, got about 40 degrees into the rotation, and she was already on him, already pressing, and the second shot took him low in the neck above the plate carrier, and he went down sideways, and the weapon he'd been raising discharged once into the ground when he hit. The hostage was already moving. She'd gone to ground the moment the first shot fired. Good instinct, either trained or simply the natural response of someone who understood that standing upright in an active shooting situation was suboptimal, and she was crawling away from the escorts on her hands and knees, zip ties making it awkward, moving fast anyway. On the road, Cole's soldiers read it immediately. 2 of them broke from the barricade without being told, running low, angling toward the hostage. Isla tracked them briefly through the scope to confirm they weren't going to cross her angle to the vehicle, and they weren't. They were approaching from the right, away from her lane. She swung the scope to Voss. He was still in the hatch. He hadn't moved. And she understood in that moment, looking at him through the magnification, his face now close enough that she could see the specific texture of his expression, that he wasn't surprised. He'd lost 2 men and a hostage in under 4 seconds, and his face showed approximately what a person's face shows when they get a weather update they don't like. It was recalibration, not shock. The loss was being processed and filed and responded to, and the response was already being formulated. He looked directly at her position. He couldn't see her. She was in the ditch, below the road lip, nothing visible. But he was looking at the right area again. The calculation had updated. He knew roughly where she was. He reached for the radio handset inside the hatch. She heard it before she saw it. The shift in engine note from the vehicles on the road. The specific sound of diesel engines moving from idle to power. Not the lead vehicle. The second and third. Flanking. They were going to try to flank her position in the ditch, using the vehicles as cover, drive them out wide and pin the angle. And if they got the vehicles far enough forward, she'd be in a crossfire between the vehicle guns and whatever was on the reverse slope. She had 7 rounds left. She came up out of the ditch. Standing was wrong tactically. Standing exposed her. She knew this. She did it anyway because prone in the ditch gave her an angle on exactly nothing, and she needed to move and she needed to do it in the next 15 seconds before the flanking vehicles got into position. She ran, not straight, cutting angles, using the burned-out chassis of the second convoy vehicle as a waypoint, sliding behind it and going prone and getting the scope up in one practiced motion that her body performed while her conscious mind was still arguing about whether this was a good idea. The angle from behind the chassis was better. The lead vehicle was now at about 80 meters, close enough that the BTR's outline filled a significant portion of her field of view. She could see the armor plating, the weld lines, the equipment mounted on the exterior. She wasn't going to punch around through the armor. That was not a conversation the SR-98 could win. But the hatch was open. She moved the scope. Found it. Found Voss. He was talking into the handset and simultaneously scanning, and there was a quality to his movement that she recognized from the briefing footage. Controlled, economical, the specific fluency of a man who'd been in worse situations and come out of them. He wasn't panicking. He was working. She needed him to do one thing, just one. She needed him to turn far enough in the hatch that the angle was clear. He turned. She didn't take the shot. She realized afterward, in the split second after her finger had released the trigger pressure and her brain had caught up to what her eye was seeing, that she'd almost done it. Almost. The angle was there. The shot was there. And she'd let it go because something in the way he moved as he turned had shown her something mounted on the inside of the hatch. A secondary screen, small, tactical display. And what was on it had reached through the scope and grabbed her somewhere behind the sternum. A grid reference. Her grid reference, her current position, accurate to within 20 meters. He hadn't been calculating from observation. He had a source. Someone was feeding him her position in real time. She came out from behind the chassis before the thought had fully assembled itself, moving laterally, putting distance between herself and the position he had plotted, cutting back toward the rock face at an angle she hadn't used before. A round cracked off the road surface 6 feet behind her. Then another one, tracking her movement, adjusting. She went behind a shattered section of retaining wall, 3 feet of concrete, solid enough, and pressed flat and tried to breathe and think simultaneously. Somewhere in the convoy or on the ridgeline or in the positions she'd cleared, there was a device or a person feeding her location forward in real time. She ran through the possibilities quickly, mechanically, the way she'd been trained. A drone she hadn't seen, possible. The cloud cover was thick, and a small UAV would be nearly invisible against it. A planted sensor in the convoy vehicles, possible, sophisticated, implied advance access. Someone alive on the ridge who she'd missed, possible. She looked up. Above her, the ledge where she'd been lying was visible. The fault line she'd climbed, the rock face. And on the ridge, a position she'd cleared or thought she'd cleared on the far left flank, something moved. Hartman was supposed to have gone to check on Mathers. She grabbed her radio. Cole had given her a handset before she'd gone into the ditch. She keyed it. Cole, where's Hartman? Static. Then, he went to Mathers. Why? Is he with Mathers right now? A pause. She could hear Cole moving, heard him ask someone something. The answer came back not from Cole, but from Quan. Sir, Hartman's not here. Mathers hasn't seen him since... She was already moving. The left flank position she'd cleared was 200 meters up the ridge. She'd put a round through the gap in the rock at a man she'd identified by his jacket sleeve, and then she'd moved on because she'd had other targets and the position had gone quiet, and quiet meant handled. She'd assumed. She climbed the ridge at an angle, using the rock face as cover, moving faster than was safe because speed was the only currency she had right now, and she was spending it. The wind had come back up, 6 knots, maybe 7, and it covered some of her noise. The position was a natural alcove in the rock. Good cover, good sight lines down to the road. She'd put her round through the gap from 200 meters away and through a 2-foot opening, and she'd been confident in the shot, and she'd moved on. But the man in the position hadn't been the one she'd seen. The sleeve she'd targeted had been someone else's. The person feeding observation back to Voss, positioned deliberately to look like the gunner when he wasn't. A decoy designed to get her attention and her round and leave the actual observer untouched. Sophisticated. 3 years ago, she might have called it too sophisticated for a mercenary operation. 3 years ago, she'd been wrong about a lot of things. She reached the edge of the alcove. Stopped. Listened. A voice, low, talking into something. She couldn't hear the words. She could hear the pattern. Not conversational. Reporting. Coordinates, most likely. She went around the corner. Private Hartman was crouched in the back of the alcove with a compact radio device in his hands and his back to the entrance, which was the mistake people made when they thought they were safe and hidden and didn't expect to be found. I was speaking into the device in a low, flat voice, and he was reading numbers. She recognized the format. MGRS grid, and what he was reading corresponded to where she'd been 60 seconds ago. He heard her boot on the rock, started to turn. She got there first. She didn't use the rifle. No room, wrong tool. She caught his arm as he turned, leveraged it, took him down onto the rock floor of the alcove with enough force to knock the radio device out of his hand. It clattered off the rock wall, and she kicked it to the far side of the alcove. He tried to get up, and she put a knee on his back and her forearm across his shoulders and pressed. "Stop," she said. He stopped. He was breathing very hard. She could feel it through her forearm, the specific breathing of someone who's scared and has also just had the wind knocked out of them. She held him there and looked at the radio device. Small, compact, encrypted. Not standard issue. Not something you picked up from supply. "How long?" she said. He didn't answer. She pressed harder. Not brutal, just enough. "How long have you been reporting to him?" Silence. Then, 6 weeks. "Since before the deployment?" "Yes." She looked at the back of his head. He was 20 years old, maybe 21. She thought about what 6 weeks of reporting meant, what it had enabled, what had been compromised, who might have been hurt because of the information. She thought about the convoy route that Voss had known well enough to place an ambush on the most vulnerable section. She thought about Mather's leg and the soldier who'd taken the round through the shoulder and the 3 people in the medical manifest. "Did you know there was a medical team on this convoy?" she said. A pause. "Yes." She stood up, let him up. He turned around and pressed himself against the far wall of the alcove and looked at her. His face was very young and very pale, and he was trying not to cry, which she could see him trying to do and failing at incrementally. She felt something. She wasn't sure what to call it exactly. Not pity, not contempt, something more complicated and less useful than either. She looked at the radio device. "Is there a check-in protocol?" she said. He blinked. "What?" "Does Voss expect to hear from you on a schedule? What happens if you miss a transmission?" He stared at her. She could see him processing the question, not the emotional fact of it, but the practical implication. Every 15 minutes. If I miss 2 consecutive, they assume you're compromised and pull back." "I don't know. I think so." She looked at her watch, picked up the radio device. He flinched when she reached past him for it. "Don't," she said. Not a threat, just information. He stilled. She looked at the device. It was encrypted and she didn't have the key, but she didn't need the key for what she was thinking. She needed the transmission format and the timing. She set the device down. "Sit down. Don't touch this. Don't move." She keyed the handset. "Cole." He came back immediately. "Where are you? What's happening?" "I'm at the left flank position. I have Hartman. He's alive." She paused. "He's been feeding our position to Voss for 6 weeks." The silence on the radio lasted about 2 seconds. It was a specific kind of silence, not empty, full of something that was being compressed and contained. "Is he secure?" Cole said finally. "Yes." "Is he hurt?" "No." "Good." Another pause. "Keep him that way. We'll deal with it later." He sounded like a man who had added a new item to a list that was already too long and was refusing to let it change his operational calculus. "What's your status?" "I have 7 rounds. I need a better angle on the lead vehicle. The flanking vehicles, what are they doing?" Stopped. Voss called them back. A pause. "He's been sitting there for 3 minutes. Not advancing, not retreating, just sitting." She looked down at the road from the alcove. She could see the lead vehicle at this angle, the hatch still open, Voss still in it. He'd called his flankers back. He'd lost his position feed. He was adapting, which meant he was buying time, which meant he was working on something. "He's not done," she said. "No," Cole said. "We've got something else. The radio, the jury-rigged one. We got a partial transmission through. QRF is inbound. 30 minutes, maybe less." 30 minutes. She looked at the vehicles. At the reverse slope where the staging area was still sitting, still waiting. At the hostage, who had been reached by Cole's soldiers and was now behind the barricade. She could see that from here, the red cross of the medical vest visible at the edge of the overturned vehicle. Voss knew about the QRF. He'd have the same signals intelligence she did, probably better. He had 30 minutes to either complete the mission or extract, And he'd been in this business long enough to understand that running a ground assault against a consolidated defensive position with air assets inbound was a losing calculation, which meant he was going to extract, which meant he was going to get into that vehicle and drive back up the road and disappear into the Karsk Highlands and be someone else's problem in a different country in 6 months. Unless she looked at the radio device, at Hartman, at the alcove and the angle it gave her and the distance to the road. The lead vehicle was 300 meters. The hatch was open. Voss was in it. She did the calculation. 300 meters, wind at 7 knots from the left, slight downhill angle, target partially obscured by hatch rim, but exposed from approximately the mid-chest up when he stood in the hatch. Suppressible. Manageable. 3 years ago, she wouldn't have hesitated. 3 years ago, she also hadn't hesitated to move instead of taking the shot, and David was dead. She looked through the scope. Voss was on the radio. She could see his mouth moving, see the handset, see the specific posture of a man who is giving instructions rather than receiving them. He wasn't looking at the ridge anymore. He was looking at the road ahead, the exit route. He'd already decided. She found her respiratory pause. She pressed the trigger. The rifle fired and the round crossed 300 meters in approximately 4/10 of a second, and Voss's handset exploded in his hand. He dropped below the hatch rim. She cycled the bolt. If he came back up, he didn't come back up. The lead vehicle's engine revved. It started moving, not toward the barricade, away, backward, fast, the vehicle accelerating in reverse up the road, and the second and third vehicles following. In the staging area on the reverse slope, she could see, from this elevation she could just see, the personnel there breaking from their positions, loading into their vehicles, the whole element beginning to collapse and withdraw with the speed of a unit that had just received an extraction order. She held her position, watched, kept the scope on the area where Voss had been in the hatch. The vehicles were accelerating, moving, retreating. She released her breath. She wasn't sure if the round had hit him. She'd aimed for the handset, the communications device, the thing that was coordinating the assault, and she'd hit it. Whether Voss was alive or dead, she couldn't tell from here. Whether the hand holding the handset had taken anything, she couldn't tell. The vehicle was moving and the hatch was closed now, and there was no way to know. She sat with that for a moment. The not knowing. It was familiar, actually. More familiar than certainty. Cole's voice came through the handset. "The vehicles are withdrawing. Both flanks are withdrawing. What did you do?" "I took a shot," she said. "At what?" "His radio." Silence. "Did you hit Voss?" "I don't know," she said. "I hit something." She looked at the retreating vehicles. "He's retreating. That's what matters right now." "Is he alive?" She watched the lead vehicle disappear around the first curve of the road above, trailing dust and diesel smoke. She watched the second vehicle follow. The third. "I don't know," she said again. And the honest answer, the one she sat with in the wind at 300 meters of altitude with 7 expended casings and 6 rounds remaining and the particular cold of the Karsk Highlands pressing through her jacket, was that she didn't know how she felt about that either. Whether she wanted him dead or wanted him alive so she could look at him and ask him one specific question about a mission 3 years ago that she had never been able to answer for herself. Whether those were different things, even. She looked at Hartman. He was sitting against the wall of the alcove where she'd told him to sit, knees drawn up, face in his hands. Young, scared, already starting to understand the specific weight of what he'd done and what was coming. She thought about telling him something. She couldn't think of anything worth saying. She looked back at the road. The staging area on the reverse slope had gone quiet. The sound of engines faded up the mountain. Below on the road, she could hear Cole's soldiers moving, could hear voices, louder now, the specific texture of relief beginning to filter through exhaustion. And in the distance, faint but growing, and unmistakable to anyone who'd ever been in the field, the low beat of rotors. The QRF was early. She looked at her watch. 23 minutes. Someone had pushed it. She sat on the rock and looked at the sky and let the sound of the rotors get louder and didn't feel anything very clearly except the specific ache of her elbows where the gravel had taken the skin off, and the particular weight of the rifle across her knees, and somewhere underneath all of it, not triumph, nothing like that. Something more like the exhausted, complicated feeling of a person who has done the thing she was afraid she couldn't do and found out she could and doesn't yet know what to do with that information. The helicopters came in from the south, low and fast, and the whole valley opened up to receive them. The first helicopter touched down on the road surface 60 meters from the barricade, and before the skids had fully settled, 2 medics were out and running toward the consolidated wounded. The second bird held in a low hover over the ridge, door gunner scanning the reverse slope, and the third landed in the open ground below the valley mouth where the armored vehicles had been. Isla watched all of it from the alcove. She watched the medics reach Mathers and start cutting his pant leg. Watched Cole meet the QRF commander, a major she didn't recognize, compact, moving fast, and begin talking with the contained urgency of someone who has a lot of information to transfer in a short time. Watched Ruiz and Kwan and the other survivors get their first sustained breath in 2 hours, the physical relief of it visible even from 300 meters up. She watched, and she didn't go down. It wasn't a decision exactly. It was more that going down had consequences she wasn't ready to walk into, and up here she still had a few minutes before those consequences became unavoidable. She used them. She cleaned the rifle, ran a patch through the bore, checked the suppressor attachment, counted the remaining rounds, and set them in a row on the rock beside her like an inventory. 6 rounds. She'd started with 22 and ended with 6, and the difference between those numbers was a morning she would be processing for a long time. Hartman was still against the wall. He hadn't moved since she'd told him not to. He'd stopped trying not to cry at some point. She didn't know when exactly, hadn't been watching, and had simply been sitting with it, which was either composure or exhaustion or both. His face was blotched and his eyes were red, and he looked like what he was, a very young man who had done something he couldn't undo and was only beginning to understand the shape of it. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Is my family going to be safe?" he said. She hadn't expected that. She'd been expecting a defense or a justification or silence, not that. "I don't know," she said. "They threatened my family. I'm not saying that's an excuse. I know it's not, but that's what they used." He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth briefly. "My sister. They knew where she lived. They had photographs." She sat with that. Didn't say anything. "I don't know if that changes anything," he said. "It doesn't change what happened," she said. "It might change what happens next. That's for people above both of us to decide." She looked at the radio device. "You need to tell them everything, every contact, every transmission, everything you gave them, dates, grid references, everything you can remember." "I know. Don't try to minimize it. Don't try to protect yourself by leaving things out. The only thing that gets worse from here is if they find out you withheld something." He nodded. His jaw was tight. She picked up the rifle and the remaining rounds and stood. "Come on." Cole saw her coming down the ridge with Hartman in front of her. Not at gunpoint. She hadn't drawn the pistol. She didn't need to. And he excused himself from the QRF commander and walked to meet them at the road. He looked at Hartman. Hartman looked at the ground. "I'll take him," Cole said. "He has information that needs to go up immediately. The device," she held it out, "is encrypted, but the signals unit should be able to pull the transmission logs." Cole took the device, looked at it, looked at Hartman. "Estevez," he called. Corporal Estevez materialized from somewhere behind the second vehicle. "Sir?" "Take Private Hartman to Captain Reese. Tell Reese he needs to be held, and that I'll explain in 10 minutes. "Yes, sir." Estevez took Hartman by the arm, not unkindly, and moved him toward the QRF position. Hartman went without resistance, which was the right choice and probably the only coherent choice he had left. Cole watched them go. Then he turned back to Isla. He looked at her elbows first, the exposed raw skin where the gravel had gone to work, and then at her face. "There's a medic," he said. I know. In a minute." "You should—" "In a minute, sir." She met his eyes. He let it go. They stood on the road for a moment. Around them, the organized machinery of post-contact recovery was assembling itself. QRF soldiers establishing a perimeter, medics working, the first helicopter already lifting off with Mathers, and the other critical wounded secured inside. The valley was quieter than it had been in 2 hours. The quiet had texture, the specific texture of aftermath. "Voss?" Cole said. "I don't know." The round, I aimed for the handset. I hit the handset. Whether the secondary effect reached him, I don't know. The vehicle moved under its own power. The driver was functional. She paused. "He may be wounded. He may be fine. I can't tell you. Cole nodded. He didn't look satisfied with that, but he looked like he understood that it was the honest answer. Intel is going to want everything you have. Voss's presence here, the identification, the targeting. I know. They're going to have questions about how you identified him at that distance under those conditions. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. Is there anything you want to tell me before that conversation happens? Anything I should know so I can... He stopped, started again. So I can represent this accurately when I write the report. She understood what he was offering. Not cover. He wasn't the type. But framing. Context. The difference between a report that raised questions and a report that answered them before they were asked. My classification status lapsed when I transferred to logistics, she said. The program I was in, it's not active in the way it was. Some of the files are still restricted, some aren't. What I can tell you is my name, my service record as it appears in the unclassified system, and what happened today. The rest is going to require someone with a higher clearance to unlock. Will they unlock it? I genuinely don't know. She looked down the road at the curve where the armored vehicles had disappeared. It depends on whether Voss is alive and what he decides to do next. If he's alive and he talks... She paused. There are people in the system who would prefer that certain files stay closed. A live Voss with intelligence value creates pressure in both directions. Cole absorbed that without visibly reacting. I was good at that, she'd noticed, taking in complicated information and filing it without letting the filing show. The hostage, she said. The medical personnel. Is she all right? Shaken. Physically unharmed. He paused. She asked who pulled her out of that. What did you tell her? I told her one of our soldiers. I didn't have a better answer at the time. He looked at her. She's going to want to know eventually. Tell her whatever you want, Isla said. It doesn't matter. Cole started to say something, stopped, then, it matters to her. She didn't have an answer to that. She looked at her hands, the raw elbows, the rifle in her arms. She thought about what it would mean for things to matter in the way he was describing, the way outcomes landed on people personally, had weight, required acknowledgement, and found that the idea of it was more exhausting than the crawl through the frozen ditch had been. Let me talk to the medic, she said, and then I'll give whoever needs it a full statement. The medic's name was Specialist Ochoa. She was efficient and relatively painless about the elbows, which Isla appreciated. She irrigated the wounds, applied a topical, wrapped both forearms with practiced speed, while making the kind of small talk that was really just a way of monitoring for shock, asking questions that required coherent answers, watching the eyes. You're not in shock, Ochoa said. No. You've been in contact before. It wasn't a question. Isla didn't answer it. Ochoa finished the second forearm and stepped back. Anything else? Pain anywhere? My knees. From the crawl? From the climb, mostly. Ochoa checked both knees, confirmed nothing structural, wrapped the left one, which had taken the worst of the gravel. You're going to feel all of this tomorrow, she said. I know. Is this your rifle? Isla looked at where the SR-98 was resting against the vehicle beside her. Yes. You mind if I ask what you do in this company? She looked at Ochoa. The medic had the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who had seen what the rifle had accomplished and was trying to reconcile it with the logistics tab on Isla's uniform. Supply specialist, Isla said. Ochoa looked at the rifle, looked at the wrapped forearms, looked at the rifle again. Right, she said, with the tone of someone who has decided to let a thing be what it is. The debrief happened in the back of one of the QRF vehicles, a cramped MRAP that smelled of diesel and cold metal, with a folding table that someone had set up and a recording device that someone else had placed on it without comment. 3 people sat across from her. Major Dion Reese, the QRF commander, who had the alert, slightly over-caffeinated look of someone who'd been running on operational tempo for too many consecutive days. Captain Lena Farrow from Battalion Intelligence, who had arrived on the 3rd helicopter and who Isla had never met but recognized the type immediately, still, watchful, asking questions with her eyes before she asked them with her mouth, and Cole, who had a legal pad and a pen and said less than either of the other 2 but wrote everything down. Reese started. Private First Class Morgan. You understand this is a preliminary debrief, not a formal inquiry. You are not under investigation at this time. You are entitled to have a JAG representative present, but given the operational tempo. I'm fine without one, she said. Farrow wrote something. Tell me what happened, Reese said. From your perspective, start to finish. She told them. She was organized about it. Timeline, positions, decisions, outcomes. She gave them the round counts, the ranges, the sequence of targets. She described the ditch crawl and the hostage extraction. She described finding Hartman. She described the shot at the handset. When she got to the part about identifying Voss, Farrow leaned forward slightly. Not much. Enough. You identified the commander of the hostile element as Darius Voss, Farrow said, at a range of over 400 meters, in smoke and poor visibility. How? Posture and behavioral signature. I'd reviewed extensive footage of the subject during a previous assignment. What assignment? Classified. Farrow's eyes moved to Reese. He looked at Isla. Morgan, we need to understand your background to contextualize what happened today. Your service file shows— I know what my service file shows, she said. It shows 4 years of active service, a lateral transfer to logistics 3 years ago, and nothing before that except a basic service entry. What it doesn't show is the 2 years before that, which are under a restriction level that requires clearances neither of you currently holds. She paused. I'm not being obstructive. I'm telling you the practical reality. If you want those files unlocked, that request goes up through channels, and someone decides whether to grant it. I can't make that decision, and neither can you. The silence in the MRAP was not hostile, but it was not comfortable either. Reese leaned back. Farrow picked up her pen and held it without writing. What can you tell us, Farrow said carefully, about your operational capability? The capability you demonstrated today. I'm a trained precision shooter. I was trained to a high standard in a program that emphasized long-range engagement, target identification, environmental adaptation, and fieldcraft. I've maintained proficiency independently since leaving the program. You've been maintaining proficiency while assigned to logistics. Yes. Where? Privately. In my own time. There are ranges. There are ways to maintain skills without institutional support. Farrow looked at her for a long moment. The M in the file. The proficiency classification box. It's blank. The program didn't share documentation with conventional units. We can see that. Another pause. The round count you described, 13 confirmed kills in the primary engagement, 2 escorts, the handset shot. That's 16 engagements in approximately 2 hours at ranges from 30 to 700 meters. 6 of the ridge engagements were under 400. The suppressor work at range is more demanding. I'm aware of what the suppressor work at range involves, Farrow said, with a slight edge that told Isla she was talking to someone who had field time she wasn't advertising. I'm trying to understand what level of training produces that. Isla looked at her. The best level, she said. The program had very high standards. Who ran the program? I can't tell you that without the clearances being granted. Farrow sat back. She wasn't frustrated. Or if she was, she'd compressed it into something that looked more like professional assessment. She looked at Cole. Captain, your statement says you had no prior knowledge of PFC Morgan's capability before she volunteered. Correct, Cole said. She was assigned to your company 4 days ago. Yes. And in those 4 days, she filed supply manifests and processed inventory. She didn't speak much. I didn't know her name before this morning, which is a failure on my part that I intend to correct going forward across the entire company. He said it evenly, without self-flagellation. A statement of fact and a forward-looking correction. Clean. Farrow looked at him for a moment. Captain, did you authorize the tactical employment of PFC Morgan? Yes. Under what authority? My own. I was the senior officer present. I assessed the situation. I had a resource available. I used it. She's a supply specialist. She's a soldier who demonstrated capability and offered it. In a situation where I had 12 personnel, no air support, and a sniper actively suppressing my ability to maneuver, I used what I had. His voice was still even. But there was something underneath it, not aggression, something more like certainty. I'd make the same decision again. Farrow looked between them. The recording device sat in the middle of the table, its small light blinking. PFC Morgan, Reese said. Darius Voss. Your previous program was running surveillance on him? Yes. Can you tell me the nature of that surveillance? No. Can you tell me whether you had previous direct contact with Voss? No direct contact. I was in observation roles. But he identified you today. Or he identified a precision shooter in a convoy unit and inferred who I was. I don't know which. She paused. The radio intercept said he asked for a shooter by name. I would want to see the full text of that intercept before I confirmed what name was used. Farrow and Reese exchanged a look. Farrow reached into the folder in front of her and slid a single sheet across the table. Isla picked it up. Read it. The intercept was 2 lines. The first line was the request for the convoy to stand down. The second line was the demand, and the name in it was not her name. It was a call sign, one she hadn't used in 3 years, that didn't appear anywhere in her unclassified file, that no one outside the program should have had access to. She set the paper back on the table. Well, she said. You recognize it, Farrow said. Yes. Is it yours? It was. Which means Voss had access to program information. Apparently, she kept her face neutral while working through what that meant. The program's internal records were restricted at a level that required deliberate access, not passive intelligence collection. If Voss had her call sign, someone had given it to him, which meant the security problem was not Hartman, or not only Hartman. Hartman had been feeding current position data, recent, operational. The call sign was 3 years old, 2 different sources, 2 different layers. I'm going to need you to write down everything you know about who had access to that call sign, Farrow said. Everyone, every person in your chain who would have known it. That list is short. Write it down. Isla looked at the blank legal pad Farrow pushed across the table, picked up the pen, wrote 4 names. 3 of them she was confident in. The 4th she wrote after a pause of about 5 seconds, a pause she was aware Farrow noticed. And the 4th name she wrote with the specific reluctance of someone writing something they'd been avoiding thinking about for a long time. She pushed the pad back. Farrow read the names. Her expression didn't change, which was itself an expression. She looked at Reese. We're going to need to make some calls, she said. I know, he said. She looked at Isla. You're going to stay in theater for the time being. Don't discuss the specifics of today with anyone outside this vehicle until I clear you. Understood. The rifle. Farrow looked at it, propped against the MRAP wall. It's not in any manifest. Technically, it's unauthorized personal equipment in a theater of operations. The MRAP was quiet for a moment. Cole's pen stopped moving. Yes, Isla said. I'm going to need to note that. I understand. Farrow looked at it for another second. Then she looked at the recording device. Then she reached over and stopped the recording, which was not something Isla had expected. In the silence after the click, Farrow said, It's noted, and then it's filed. And given the day's outcome, I think we can all agree that how it's filed has some flexibility. She looked at Isla. Within reason. Isla looked back at her. Within reason, she agreed. Reese cleared his throat. That's all for now. Morgan, you're restricted to the QRF perimeter until further notice. Get some food, get some rest. The medic already looked at you? Yes, sir. Good. Cole, I need your full statement in writing by 1800. Yes, sir. The debrief broke. Reese left first. Farrow gathered her folder, paused at the door of the MRAP, looked back at Isla. The 4th name on the list, she said. You paused before you wrote it. Yes. Why? Isla looked at her. Because he was a friend, she said. Was. Farrow held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, one small professional nod, and left. Cole stayed. He sat across from her in the empty MRAP with his legal pad and didn't say anything for a while. Outside, they could hear the organized sounds of the perimeter being established, radio traffic, the distant thrum of the remaining helicopter running a circuit of the valley. The 4th name, he said. You saw it. I was writing everything down. Yes. He paused. Were you close? At one point. She looked at the table. I was in the program with me. He left 6 months before I did. We weren't in contact after. She paused. I don't know if he gave Voss the call sign willingly or if Voss extracted it. I don't know which version I'm hoping for. Because if he gave it willingly, Then I misjudged him completely, and everything I thought was real wasn't. She looked up. And if Voss extracted it, then he went through something bad enough to break what I thought were his limits, and I have to think about what that means for a person. Cole was quiet. Either way, he's on the list, she said. Yes. She looked at her wrapped forearms, at the hands below them, steady, as they'd been all day. She thought about steadiness, about the fact that it had held when she'd needed it, and that there was something both reassuring and slightly alarming about that, about finding out that you are more capable under extreme pressure than you'd spent 3 years believing. Cole, she said. Yeah. What happened to Hartman? I know what the outcome probably is. I'm not asking about that. She paused. The family he mentioned. His sister. That's going to get flagged for protection review. If his account checks out, the coercion claim, it changes the classification of what he did. It doesn't change what he did. No, but it changes why. Cole set down his pen. People do things under threats to family that they wouldn't do otherwise. The system has to account for that, or it stops making distinctions. She looked at him. That's a generous position for an officer whose soldiers got ambushed partly because of what Hartman told them. I know. He didn't flinch from it. Mathers is going to be fine. The shoulder wound is clean. The 2 critical are stable. Nobody died today who wasn't already... He stopped. Nobody from my company died today. Given what we walked into, that's... He stopped again. That's something. Yes, she said. It is. He picked up the legal pad, looked at it. I'm going to write the report exactly as it happened. I'm not going to make it easier or harder than it was. I know. Which means your name is in it. What you did is in it. It's going to get read by people who are going to want to know more. I know. Is that all right? She thought about it. The question deserved an honest answer, not a reflexive one. She thought about 3 years of logistics assignments and manifests and the rifle case she'd kept because she couldn't decide whether to need it or not. She thought about today, the weight of it, the accumulated decisions, the things that had held, and the things that had shaken. She thought about Pharaoh's eyes when she'd read the list of names, and about what it meant that the call sign was known, and about whether the work she'd walked away from was actually something you could walk away from, or whether it just waited, patient, until the right moment to prove that walking away had been an option, not a fact. Yes, she said, write it as it happened. He nodded, started writing. She sat in the MRAP and listened to the valley outside. Quieter now. The particular quiet of a place that had been violent and was settling. And she looked at her hands, still steady. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a comfort or a complication. The recording device sat in the middle of the table, switched off, its small red light no longer blinking. Around them, the afternoon was going gray at the edges, the Karst Highlands swallowing the light. The way they swallowed everything, slowly, completely, without particular interest in what they took. And somewhere above, on a road that curved back into the high ground, a convoy of armored vehicles was moving, and the man who might or might not be alive in the lead vehicle's command hatch was moving with them, carrying whatever she'd given him, wound or just a ruined radio, she still didn't know, toward wherever men like that went when operations didn't conclude the way they'd planned. She'd taken the shot. The outcome was what it was. She was still here. She kept coming back to that. Not as consolation, just as fact, clean and unadorned, the way the best facts were. She was still here. Cole was still writing when the MRAP door opened and Specialist Ochoa leaned in. Sir, Morgan, they've got food set up at the perimeter if either of you want it. Cole looked up. 5 minutes. Ochoa looked at Isla, who nodded, and then she was gone and the door was closed again, and the MRAP was quiet, except for the scratch of Cole's pen and the distant radio traffic outside. Isla sat. She wasn't hungry, but she understood that eating was a mechanical necessity and that the body's opinion on the matter was irrelevant. She'd learned that in the program, the discipline of maintenance, of treating the body like equipment that needed servicing regardless of whether you felt like servicing it. She thought about the 4th name on the list. She thought about it the way you think about a splinter you can't quite reach, aware of it constantly, pressing against it from angles that didn't help. Marcus Vell. She'd written it without looking up, without hesitating more than those 5 seconds, because hesitating longer would have been dishonest, and she was done with that particular form of self-protection. Marcus had been in the program 2 years before her. He'd trained her first month, not officially, not as an assigned instructor, but the way people train each other in tight units, through proximity and repetition, and the slow transfer of knowledge that happens when two people spend enough hours looking through scopes in the same direction. He'd been methodical, patient, slightly arrogant in the specific way of people who are genuinely very good at something and know it. She'd respected him. More than respected him. For a while, she'd trusted him the way you trusted very few people, completely, without reservation, the way you had to trust a spotter. Then he'd left the program. Transfer, they'd said. Different assignment. She hadn't asked questions because you didn't ask questions, and then 6 months later she'd been on the mission that killed David, and the questions had stopped mattering because everything had stopped mattering for a while. She'd written his name on Pharaoh's legal pad and pushed it across the table, and now it was in a folder somewhere being processed by people with clearances she no longer held. And what happened next with Marcus Vell was no longer her decision. That was both a relief and a specific kind of grief, and she sat with both without trying to resolve them. Cole finished writing, capped the pen. "Ready?" "Yes," she said. The food was MREs heated in their pouches, chicken and rice for her, something unidentifiable for Cole, consumed standing near the perimeter because the folding tables were being used for equipment and casualty processing. The valley had gone fully gray. Temperature was dropping again. Somewhere above, the last helicopter was finishing its circuit. Ruiz found her while she was still eating. He came over with the particular walk of someone who has something to say and hasn't worked out exactly how to say it yet, slightly sideways, like he might veer off if given an opportunity. He stopped a few feet away. "Hey," he said. "Ruiz." He stopped. "Tried again. The noise I made. On the right side. Was that the right call?" She looked at him. He was asking seriously, not for reassurance, asking the way people ask when they genuinely want to understand the mechanics of a decision and what it produced. "Yes," she said. "Exactly what was needed. I didn't hit anything. I was just making muzzle flash and noise. That was the job." He seemed to sit with that for a moment, then the ditch, the crawl. How far was that? 50 meters? Maybe a little more? In what, 90 seconds? Longer. There were stops. He shook his head. Not in disbelief, more like the gesture people make when they're filing something away, updating a category. "I've been in this company 8 months, he said. "I didn't know your name 3 hours ago." "Nobody did." "That bothers me." She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell from the way he said it, the slight tension in his jaw. Not embarrassment, something more like accountability. I was 22 years old and he was taking it personally, which was either admirable or impractical, and she wasn't sure those were mutually exclusive. "Don't let it bother you too long," she said. "Use it." He nodded slowly. "Yes, Morgan." Then with a half-second of hesitation, "Should I be calling you something else? Given Morgan is fine." He nodded again and left, and she watched him go and ate the rest of her chicken and rice and thought that 8 months from now he was going to be a much better soldier than he was today, which was already better than most. She didn't know why she thought that. She just did. The night was long and cold, and she didn't sleep much. They'd set up in the shelter of the rock face, QRF soldiers and Cole's survivors combined, thermal blankets and body heat doing what they could against 15 below. The second helicopter had taken the remaining wounded out after dark. The perimeter was maintained in rotating watches. Isla took a watch, 3 hours, midnight to 3, standing in the dark with the rifle in the particular silence of mountains at night, which was not really silence but a different kind of noise, one that had no human component. She used the 3 hours to think. Not productively, exactly, more the way you turn a problem over in your hands without expecting to solve it, just to understand the shape of it better. She thought about David Okafor, about the specific quality of his patience in a hide. He'd been capable of absolute stillness for 6 hours at a stretch, which she'd always envied because her stillness required active maintenance while his seemed structural. She thought about the last conversation they'd had before the mission, which had been unremarkable. Logistics, timing, weather forecast, because they hadn't known it was the last one, the way you never did. She thought about the decision she'd made that day. Move instead of stay. She'd made it because the tactical calculus in the moment had suggested it was the right call. 2 people extracted was better than 1 shot taken and 1 person lost. And she'd had maybe 4 seconds to decide, and she'd decided wrong. Or decided right and had wrong happen anyway. She'd never been able to fully separate those 2 things, and maybe she never would, and maybe that was the more honest conclusion, that some decisions were made in 4 seconds with incomplete information, and the outcome was partly outside your control, and the mistake wasn't the decision, but the 3 years of treating the decision as a verdict. She thought about the shot at the handset. She'd aimed for the radio, not the man. People would read that choice in different ways. Pharaoh would probably read it as professional restraint or tactical pragmatism, take out communications, force withdrawal, preserve the intelligence value of a living subject. Cole might read it as something else. She herself wasn't entirely sure. The distance between what you decide and why you decide, it was not always as clean as the distance between the muzzle and the target. What she knew was this: she'd taken the shot she meant to take. She'd trusted her own hands. And the outcome, imperfect, unresolved, Voss's status unknown, was the outcome of taking a real shot in real conditions with real uncertainty. And that was a different thing entirely from the paralysis that had lived in her chest for 3 years. Paralysis felt like safety. It wasn't. At 3 a.m., she turned the watch over to Estevez and found a section of rock wall that blocked most of the wind and sat against it and closed her eyes. She slept until 6. The formal notification came 9 days later. She was back at Karsk Station by then, reassigned pending review, which in practice meant sitting in a supply tent processing the same inventory manifest she'd been processing before the convoy, because the Army's bureaucratic machinery operated on its own timeline, regardless of what had happened in the meantime. The work was not satisfying, but it was familiar, and familiar was a kind of anchor, and she did it without complaint and waited. Pharaoh came in person. She arrived in a vehicle with no unit markings and wore a uniform with no unit patch and carried a single folder, and she sat across from Isla in the supply tent with the manifest still spread out between them and put the folder on top of them. "Voss," she said. Isla waited. "Alive. Wounded. You caught him with fragmentation from the handset destruction. He's in a medical facility in a 3rd country that we're not going to name. He's going to recover." Isla looked at the folder. "Is he talking?" "He's cooperating." Pharaoh's tone was careful and specific, the tone of someone choosing words with precision. "There are incentives on the table. The conversation is ongoing." "What about the program records? The call sign?" "Marcus Vell." Pharaoh opened the folder. Isla didn't look at it. "He wasn't working for Voss directly. There's an intermediary. 2, actually. He was approached 14 months ago, and he says he believed he was providing information to a different entity, not Voss's organization. He says he didn't know what the information was being used for." "Do you believe that?" Pharaoh was quiet for a moment. "I believe it's possible," she said, which is not the same thing. "No. He's going to face a board. The outcome will depend on what he can provide and what can be corroborated." She paused. "I know you had history with him." Past tense is correct. "I'm not asking you to feel any particular way about it. I'm telling you because you wrote his name down and you deserve to know where it landed." Isla looked at the folder, finally reached out and looked at the first page. A summary, not the full file, redacted in large sections. Marcus Vell's photograph in the upper right corner. She'd seen that face over hundreds of hours of shared field work. It looked smaller in a photograph, flattened. She put the page back. "What happens to me?" she said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like saying it out loud to make it real. "That's the other thing I came to tell you." Pharaoh took the folder back. "The preliminary review of the Karsk Valley incident is complete. Captain Cole's report has been submitted and reviewed. The intelligence product from your identification of Voss is being assessed as significant." She paused. "There are people who want to know if you'd be willing to return to active specialized duty." Isla looked at her. "Not the old program. That's not reconstituting. Something different, a training and operational advisory role. There's a standing unit that needs people who can do what you do and also teach it." Another pause. "It's not an order. You're being asked." The supply tent was quiet. Outside, the sounds of Karsk Station, vehicles, voices, the particular institutional noise of a military installation running its daily rhythm. "Who's asking?" Isla said. People above my level. I'm the messenger. Pharaoh looked at her steadily. My read, if you want it, what you did in that valley was not a coincidence. It was the product of specific training and specific talent, and 3 years of maintenance that you kept up even when you decided you were done. People who maintain capability they've decided they don't need anymore haven't actually decided they don't need it. Isla said nothing. I'm not trying to tell you who you are, Pharaoh said. I'm telling you what I observed. I know. The answer can be no. I know that too. Pharaoh closed the folder, set it on the table, left it there, deliberately. Isla understood. The answer didn't need to be given today. Cole came to find her that evening. He was shipping out the next morning. His company was being reconstituted at a different forward position, and he had 12 hours of preparation work ahead of him. And he came anyway, which she noted. He found her outside the wire, technically, on the short stretch of cleared ground behind the station's rear perimeter, where the rock shelf dropped away and you could see a long way west in the evening light. She'd been coming out here in the evening since returning. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Possibly nothing. Possibly just the distance. He stood beside her, didn't say anything for a while. That was one of his qualities, the capacity for useful silence. Mathers is walking, he said finally. Good. Needs a cane for another 3 weeks. Complains about it constantly. Everyone is extremely relieved he's complaining given the alternative. She almost smiled, not quite. And the others? Shoulder wound is going to need physical therapy. 6 weeks, maybe more. Everyone else is functional. He paused. Ruiz asked me if there was a way to formally request a unit transfer. To where? Wherever you end up. She looked at him. He was looking west, at the light. He's a good soldier, she said. I know. I'm going to lose him eventually regardless. Might as well be to something worthwhile. He paused. What are you going to do? She'd been thinking about that. Not in the circular, unproductive way she'd been thinking about things for 3 years, the ruminative loop that went nowhere, but in the practical, forward-facing way of someone who has a real decision in front of them and is trying to make it correctly. Pharaoh came today, she said. I figured she would. They want me back in a different capacity, training and advisory. Cole nodded, said nothing. I don't know if I'm the right person to teach anything, she said. What I did in that valley, a lot of it was reactive. A lot of it was fear management. That's not the same as having something worth passing on. You managed your fear well enough to keep 14 people alive, he said. 13 of those people were already fighting. I was one element. You were the decisive element. He said it plainly, without inflation. Just the assessment. The fear management is exactly what's worth passing on. Anybody can teach a person to shoot. Very few people can teach a person to shoot when everything is falling apart and their hands are shaking. He paused. Were your hands shaking? She thought about the moment on the ledge, looking at Voss in the hatch for the first time. Yes. And then? And then they stopped. Why? She thought about it. Because the problem in front of me was more immediate than the problem behind me, she said slowly. The shaking was about the past. The work was about right now. At some point, right now took up all the available space. Cole was quiet for a moment, then, say that to a room full of candidates who are afraid they'll freeze under pressure. See if it helps. She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same space. Dry, certain, the expression of someone who has thought something through and arrived at a conclusion he considers self-evident. You've already decided, he said. It wasn't an accusation. I'm close. What's the remaining hesitation? She turned back to the western light. It was going orange at the horizon now, the color that happened when the sun hit the ice crystals in the upper atmosphere over the highlands, and it was very stark and very cold and not beautiful in any comfortable sense, but real in a way that required acknowledgement. David, she said. Cole waited. I've been treating the decision I made that day, the wrong decision, as a reason, as justification for stepping back. She kept her eyes on the horizon. As if staying out of the field was some kind of penance, like if I kept myself small enough for long enough, it would balance something. Did it? No. She said it without inflection, just the word. It didn't balance anything. He's still dead. The mission still failed. And I spent 3 years being very good at filing manifests and very bad at letting myself be what I actually am. She paused. That's not penance. That's just waste. Cole was quiet for a long time, long enough that the orange deepened and the first stars appeared at the high edge of the sky. For what it's worth, he said finally, the decision you made that day in the valley, in Karsk today, the one you were actually there for, that one looked correct to me. It was improvised. Most correct decisions are. She stood with that. She gave Pharaoh the answer 2 days later, in writing, because some things needed to be written rather than spoken. They required the permanence of the written form, the inability to take them back, the accountability of a signature at the bottom. The answer was yes. The conditions she attached were specific. She would advise, she would train, she would participate in operational planning when asked, but she would not be assigned to a fixed unit in a line role. She would retain discretion over specific operational involvement. These were not negotiable. Pharaoh, via a written response that arrived within 6 hours, agreed to all of them without modification, which told Isla something about how badly she was wanted and was slightly alarming and mostly clarifying. She packed the SR-98 case last. Everything else went into the duffel: clothes, personal items, the paperback she still hadn't read past page 40. And then she stood with the rifle case in her hands for a moment. She'd carried it for 3 years as a kind of question, an unanswered one. Am I still this person, or am I the other person? The one who files manifests and stays small and doesn't have to be accountable for what her hands can do? The answer, it turned out, had been obvious for some time. She'd just been slow to accept it. She closed the latches. The new assignment was at a training installation 400 kilometers south, a facility she'd heard referenced in the program but never visited, the kind of place that didn't appear on standard installation directories and had a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. She rode out in a vehicle with 2 other personnel who didn't ask her questions, which she appreciated. The facility was smaller than she'd expected. 12 buildings, a long range that disappeared into a valley below the main compound, a barracks block that had seen better decades, and a briefing room that was cold in the specific way of rooms that were rarely heated because the people using them were usually too focused to notice the temperature. The officer who met her was a lieutenant colonel named Strand. 60, she estimated, or close to it. Compact, white-haired at the temples, the specific kind of stillness in the face that she recognized from certain kinds of long-service people. He shook her hand. His grip was calibrated, firm without performance. Morgan, he said. Sir. I'm not going to tell you what you did in the Karsk Valley was impressive because you know it was, and I don't believe in starting professional relationships with things that are both obvious and patronizing. He held the door to the briefing room open. Come in. I'll tell you what we need. She went in. He told her. It took 40 minutes. She asked 7 questions, all of them practical. He answered all of them directly, without hedging, which was rare enough in institutional settings that she noted it as significant. The candidates she'd be working with were drawn from various units, men and women who'd shown aptitude in field assessments and had been identified as potential precision specialists. Some had significant shooting backgrounds. Some didn't. What they shared, Strand said, was a specific quality that showed up in psychological profiling and field evaluations: the capacity to function under extreme stress without dissociating from the task. That capacity can be developed, Isla said. To a degree. Strand looked at her. But the base has to be there. What do you want me to teach them? What you know. That's a broad mandate. It's intentional. He leaned back. The people we've had running this program before, technically excellent, all of them, but they taught technique, pattern, procedure. They produced very good shooters who sometimes froze when the pattern broke. He looked at her steadily. What you did in Karsk Valley wasn't pattern. Pattern would have told you to stay in position. Pattern would have kept you on the ledge. Pattern would have gotten us killed, she said. Yes. He paused. I want you to teach them to see past the pattern, to understand what they're actually doing and why, so that when the situation stops following procedure, they can still function. He paused again. I understand you have some experience with the moment when the situation stops following procedure. She looked at him. He met her gaze without apology, not pressing the wound, just acknowledging it. The specific professional acknowledgement of someone who had read her file and understood what it meant and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Yes," she said. "I have some experience with that." "Good." He stood. "You start Monday. First group is 8 candidate. Average field experience 18 months. 2 of them have more native aptitude than they know what to do with, and 3 of them have technique that's going to need rebuilding from the base up." He moved toward the door. "You'll figure out which is which." "How will I know?" He paused at the door, looked back. "You'll put them in a situation where the pattern breaks and see who adapts. Same way anyone knows anything real about a person." He held the door. "Welcome to the program, Morgan." The first day with the 8 candidates, she didn't take them to the range. She took them to a room and had them sit, and she stood in front of them with no notes and no slides and no procedure manual. And she looked at them, really looked, the way she'd learned to look through a scope, seeing past the surface to what was underneath. And then she said, "Tell me the last time you were afraid." Silence. One of the candidates, young woman, 23 maybe, name tab reading Chen, looked up from the table. "What does that have to do with everything?" Isla said. "Tell me." Chen looked at her for a moment, then she said, 18 months ago. Night patrol, contact at 40 meters. I went to ground behind cover that wasn't adequate, and I knew it wasn't adequate, and I stayed there anyway because moving felt worse." "Did you get hit?" "No." "Why not?" Chen paused. "The contact broke off." "So you made a decision under fear that was wrong, inadequate cover, and the outcome was acceptable anyway?" "Yes." "How long have you been using that outcome to tell yourself the decision was right?" Chen stared at her. "Because those are different things," Isla said. "The decision and the outcome. You can make a bad decision and have a good outcome, and you can make a good decision and have a bad outcome. And the only way to know the difference is to look at the decision, not the outcome." She looked around the room. 8 faces. "That's what we're doing here. We're going to look at decisions. We're going to get very uncomfortable with the difference between what the pattern says and what the moment requires, and then we're going to do the work of learning to trust the moment when the pattern isn't enough." She paused. "Some of you are going to hate that," she said. "That's fine. Hate it and do it anyway. Hating it doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you're paying attention." She looked at them for a moment. At the 8 faces in various states of uncertainty and attention and suppressed skepticism and something else, something she recognized from the other side of it, from being the person sitting where they were sitting, hearing something that sounded abstract until it wasn't. "We'll go to the range tomorrow," she said. "Today we talk." 3 months later, Mathers sent her a photograph. He was standing without the cane, slightly off balance, leaning a little toward the right, and the photograph was taken in a hallway that looked like a physical therapy facility, and his grin was the slightly lopsided grin of a man who has won a small but meaningful argument with his own body. On the back, in handwriting that was surprisingly neat for a man she'd pegged as someone who never wrote anything longer than a duty roster. "Thought you'd want to know. Thanks for keeping us alive long enough to hate this cane." She put the photograph on the small shelf in her room at the facility. Next to it eventually came other things. A note from Ruiz, who had been formally transferred and was now in his 3rd week of evaluation and apparently driving Strand mildly insane with questions. A printout of a brief intelligence summary that Farrow had passed through channels, indicating that Voss had completed his cooperation agreement and been transferred to a detention facility whose location was classified. A photograph she'd had for 3 years and finally taken out of the bottom of her duffel bag and put somewhere she could see it. David Okafor. Taken in the field, somewhere temperate and green, squinting against the sun, holding a coffee cup and looking like he was about to say something that was going to be either very insightful or very irritating, and probably both. She'd been the one who took the photograph. She remembered the moment. He'd said, "Stop documenting me, Morgan. I'm not a specimen." And she'd taken it anyway. She'd kept it at the bottom of the duffel for 3 years because looking at it required something she hadn't had available. Not grief. She'd had plenty of that. Something more like the willingness to hold 2 things at once, the loss and the continuing. The fact that he was dead and the fact that she was still here, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other. She looked at it now without the weight she'd carried looking at it before. Not without sadness. Sadness was appropriate, and she wasn't interested in eliminating appropriate responses to real things. But without the verdict she'd attached to it, the judgment that the loss was evidence of a fundamental failure in her that precluded everything that came after. The loss was real. The failure, the specific failure of one decision in 4 seconds with incomplete information, was also real. And she was still here, still capable of the work, still able to stand in front of 8 candidates and tell them the truth about fear and decisions and the gap between pattern and moment. All of those things were simultaneously true, and the work of the past 3 months had been learning to stand in the middle of all of them without requiring them to resolve into something simpler. They didn't resolve. That was the thing she'd gotten wrong. The assumption that at some point the weight would balance and the accounts would clear and she'd arrive at a state of settled understanding. It didn't work that way. The loss stayed. The capability stayed. The responsibility stayed. You carried all of it forward, and you did the work in front of you, and that was not a lesser thing than resolution. It was the actual thing. She looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then she picked up the notes for the next day's session. 2 of the candidates were struggling with wind estimation. One of them had a trigger discipline issue she needed to address before it became structural, and Chen had progressed faster than anyone had predicted and was going to need a different challenge soon. And she spread the notes on the desk and worked until the light outside the window went from gray to black and the facility went quiet around her. In the morning, she would stand in front of 8 people who were afraid they might not be enough, and she would tell them, not as abstraction but as something she'd found out personally, the hard way, in a frozen valley with 12 rounds and a shaking that eventually stopped, that fear was not evidence of inadequacy. Fear was evidence of accurate perception. The inadequacy was in letting it make the decisions. She turned off the light, slept. Outside, the long range disappeared into the dark valley below, and the mountains above it were indifferent and enormous, and had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. And that was not comforting exactly, but it was true. And truth had a kind of ballast to it that comfort didn't, a weight you could use when you needed something solid to push against. She had learned over these months to prefer that. The hardest battle you will ever fight is not against the enemy in front of you. It is against the voice inside you that says you are not enough. Win that one first. Everything else